Thank you, Madam Chair. And I agree with Senator Kaine on the need for us to get back to regular order, and delighted that we are producing a budget, or at least attempting to do so. It's been a long time. But more than just creating a document here, I'm hoping this will be the first step toward what we all know we have to do. Erskine Bowles testified before this committee. He said we're facing the most predictable economic crisis in our nation. He's right. He's a Democrat who's right. And look, if the Vatican can choose a pope, as they just have apparently, with all the diversity of their cardinals, we should be able to figure out how to do the basics to be able to get our deficit and debt back under control. So I'm looking for a little white smoke out of the Capitol here by the end of the summer. So this starts a good process. And, you know, we got to get to it. Right now we have an unbelievable $140,000 per household debt. Think about that. And in the last 5 years, it's gone up by $50,000 a family. That's the average debt that every household in America now represents. And that's just the start. Because you think about it, 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day. This spending soon grows to larger and larger levels. You can see that on the chart before us. And it gets to impossible levels. Impossible in the sense that literally CBO stops measuring it at some point a few decades from now, because the spending just spins out of control. So when you look at this national debt, particularly when you include state and local debt, which most people don't look at, it already does exceed that threshold that Jeff Sessions talked about at the initial part of this session, that if you get over 90% of GDP, it starts to have a major impact on today's economy. That's not just Reinhardt and Rogoff, but other studies that have looked at this. So it's already killing jobs. And who's suffering? To Senator Sanders' point earlier, it is the middle class, and it is folks who are on the bottom rung trying to get to that second or third rung. That's happening right now. So this choice before us is really pretty simple. Are we going to implement gradual and pro-growth reforms now, or are we going to have to do drastic reforms later? And perhaps, as Erskine Bowles said, after we have a debt crisis. So in order to address this, obviously we have to diagnose their cause. I heard today a lot about the fact that tax cuts and low revenues are driving these deficits. In fact, there's been a lot of history lessons given today by the chair and others talking about the role of tax cuts for the rich in driving deficits. I just can't help myself. I got to look at the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan group up here. They told us last year that, in fact, when you look at what happened between 2002 and 2011, that's when we went from a $5.6 trillion projected surplus to debts of about $6 trillion, that those so-called tax cuts for the rich that everybody is blaming today for what happened, or at least strongly implying that, guess what part that was in contributing to that incredible delta between 5.6 trillion and 6 trillion? 4%. And it was 4% of that increase in deficit if you assume there was no economic growth at all from those tax cuts. And since there are an awful lot of small businesses that got their taxes increased when we just went through this fiscal year end and got their taxes cut back in 2001, there was economic growth. We can argue how much. But if you assume there was no economic growth, it's 4%. So I'm not saying that tax reform shouldn't be part of this. Absolutely it should be. And I agree with Ron Wyden on that. But in looking at these history lessons, let's be careful. Now let's look at today. Tax revenues are set based on CBO to reach near record highs in just a couple years. They say 19.1%, and economists tend to look at this as a percent of the economy. 19.1% in a couple years, 2015. So that would put it relatively high compared to where we've been historically. It also, by the way, is 18.9% over the next decade. That is not only above the average of 18%, which is what it's been the last 50 years, it would be the second highest decade, the second highest 10-year period in American history of taxes. So to say revenues are the problem, I don't know. They're likely to go even higher, by the way, in the next 10 years after that. In the next 10 years because of bracket creep and because of taxable retirement distributions from all those baby boomers. But anyway, as this chart shows, even those record tax revenues we talked about just now won't keep pace with spending that CBO does project will be at 39% in a few decades of GDP. And by the way, this entire spending increase as a percent of GDP is driven by entitlements and net interest costs, all of it. That's just the reality. Tax revenues are projected to match or exceed the highest sustained levels in American history, 19% of GDP, and yet they won't be enough to pay for just a small fraction of the enormous mandatory spending increases that will bring spending to 39% over the next 3 decades. So One question is to just ask, what is the level of spending, revenues, and deficit we should target over the long term? My colleagues today, including the chair, have said 1-to-1 should be the mix. So given this reality, let's still go to $1 in new revenues for every $1 in spending cuts. So what does that mean? Over the long term, that means splitting the difference between that 19% and that 39%. So basically, it's balancing the budget. If you agree on balancing the budget, which I think everybody does around this table, at about 29% of GDP, or a little bit less if that deficit reduction causes interest costs to go down. So let's say 27%, 28%. That means a 40% increase in the amount of spending based on the historic average last 50 years. Do we believe that we ought to have a 40% increase in the size and scope of government, 40% more spending? I don't think so. But that's what 1-to-1 means when you extrapolate it over time. So, look, I'm for getting an agreement. I agree that we need to look at entitlements. We need to look at tax reform. And I believe that there is some consensus being reached on some of these issues now. But I've seen no realistic plan to tax anywhere close to this level that it would require if we were to get a balanced budget using this 1-to-1 mix. No one's talking about that. Simpson-Bowles aimed to balance the budget at 21% of GDP. Many of you supported that effort. Others say it should be 18%, which is the historic spending number. Some may think it should be between that or higher or lower. But whatever we decide on that, the overwhelming majority of savings have to come from spending. And again, that's because it's going to 39%. So when we say spending is the problem, it's arithmetic, as Bill Clinton famously said last summer. So given that the CBO data shows that 100% of this increase is coming from spending, that has to be the focus. With regard to these ratios we talked about, we can argue back and forth. We're not even at 3-to-1 now on the Budget Control Act. And I'll just say at the end here, I agree with Senator Wyden. We ought to be focused on tax reform. We ought to be focused on dealing with the entitlement programs, incredibly important, but not sustainable in their current form. And if we do that, I do believe we have a chance both to get this economy moving, help deal with some of these economic problems we talked about today, and avoid us doing one of two things. One would be to have to legislate in the context of a crisis, which tends to be really bad legislation, as we've seen in the past. Or second, kick the can down the road until 2017. I think that's our choice, which I think we cannot afford. So we need to get busy, and the next several months have to be really productive. Thank you, Madam Chair.